5 minutes, but I think part of setting the stage for imagining how to become these conveners, facilitators, and catalysts for family healing and community healing requires us to confront a little bit our own beliefs about the limits of what can be healed. And some of us have different experiences and different beliefs. I mean, I got the impression over here you're very hopeful about people's recovery, but I think we also know that the community has not been taught to be terribly hopeful and very categorical about healing. So I think this film fits really well. And also the reason I wanted to play it as I was thinking about Kenny, and I think this guy's story, in a way, has its own parallels to Kenny's life, and ultimately has an important, an incredible result. So let's watch. And by the way, another Australian film, so you're going to hear funny accents. I apologize. Completely coincidental. But if we could go ahead and play this.
Hi, I'm Greens MP David Shoebridge. Over the years, I've worked with many survivors of institutional abuse, and tonight's story is a remarkable tale of overcoming personal demons. Gregory Smith spent most of his life as a fringe dweller, and in 1990 ended up living rough in an isolated rainforest on the New South Wales far north coast. He could have died there, but through grit and determination, Gregory turned his life around. This is his story.
I didn't purposefully set out to go into the forest. That's where I ended up. I ended up there because I had really nowhere else to go. There were no human voices. There were no cars. There was no interference. There was just the soft sounds of the forest. I heard that frog.
And I can picture it. You know, people don't live in forests, by and large, anymore. And people live in houses and hotels and hostels, and but they don't live in forests. I mean, what do you mean you live in a forest?
I don't know how he survived in the forest, really. I mean, it gets wet up there, very wet, and it's also freezing cold up there.
The forest for him became his haven, his sense of peace. Probably not his preferred way of being, but the safest bet at that point in his life.
At one stage that he decided that to keep people safe, he needed to remove himself from society.
It's like, I don't have to run anymore. I don't have to hide. I don't have to fight. I just stop. I was going to die in there, or I was going to leave. Never would have picked this outcome.
Hello, Gregory. How nice to see you. I first met Gregory in September 2008. He came to see me because he'd had a history of trauma and he hadn't had any counselling for it. Can you understand the enormity of how you've gotten to where you are?
Yeah, maybe I don't.
When he first came to me after I came out of the forest, Gregory was still pretty disordered. He dissociated a lot.
Yeah, I remember losing days.
I know.
It's like
I know.
days. I would just black out and I would come to and there'd be this gap in my life and I couldn't explain it.
It was pretty severe stuff and he just kept on coming and slowly his story came out. I had no doubt that whatever you set out to do, you were going to get done.
When we first started talking about his experiences, there were snippets, brief insights into what he might have gone through. One day, I'll never forget the look he gave me. And he turned to me as he was driving and he said, "Do you think I'm a sociopath?" And there was a silence, and I turned to Gregory and I said, mate, if there was sociopathic behaviour in whatever you experienced, it wasn't you.
I grew up in Tamworth with my 5 sisters. My father was the most dangerous thing in my life. I didn't like him. He was a horrible human being. He always smelt. And I didn't realise it at the time, but today it was alcohol.
Family life, it was extremely frightening, it was extremely violent, it was extremely degrading. Dad was often really angry and he had been beating Mum up, and then he'd turned on us, and Gregory was trying to protect us. We didn't have a chance to run and hide. And I remember my father just beating him to a pulp. There was blood everywhere.
As a child, I was always waiting for the next beating. I was always waiting to be abused. One day, I got home from school and my mother just said, tomorrow we're going to go and see Auntie Muriel. The next day came and we were all packed into the car and we were off to Armidale. I remember thinking, wow, that's a big house Auntie Muriel lives in. It definitely wasn't Auntie Muriel's house. Where we ended up was St Patrick's Orphanage. I was 10. It hadn't occurred to me until a couple of days later that my mother had gave me away. My mother gave me away. And not only had she given me away, she told me a lie to do it. She came back and she collected us, but then she surrendered us again. She could never regain my trust or my respect after that.
I have memories of being in this dorm where all the girls slept, and I would cry myself to sleep every night. I recall standing there for hours and hours peeling potatoes. I was 4.
I was sexually abused in that orphanage, and, some of those perpetrators were young women, 15, 16-year-old women, and it was their responsibility to bath the younger boys. So, I mean, there's, to me, it's still very confusing.
The punishments were really severe, brutal. Putting kids in isolation, depriving them of things.
And underneath the staircase, there was a closet. On occasion, I would find myself locked in that closet. And I could be locked in there 4, 6, 8 hours a day, without food, without nothing. I'd just be locked in there. I developed this technique whereby I would retreat into my inner mind, and in there I built this little beautiful little forested area that had a force field, and in there I could be happy and I could be okay.
Minda is an Aboriginal word meaning shelter, and this shelter shows what the Child Welfare Department can do when it has the money.
From the age of 14, I spent around about 4.5 years in juvenile detention in the punitive system. I did some very silly things. I stole, and I mean, my respect for society was so low.
Boys generally respond well to discipline.
I remember being a teenager and him coming back into my life. By that point in time, he was really angry. And you couldn't talk to him. He was so angry.
I was given a battery of tests. I was of very low intelligence. I think my IQ was measured at 81, and psychologist, psychiatrist diagnosed me as a sociopath. And I'd ask different people around, what's a sociopath? Somebody that has contempt for society, creates a lot of violence in society. Yeah, I'm good at that. I can do all those things. Yep, not a problem. When I left the institutions, I was so angry that a person would only need to look at me sideways and I would shoulder charge them. I would headbutt them in the face. I was merciless. I was doing my apprenticeship with alcohol. Rum meant fight. Rum meant pain.
Every time he came into my house, whatever it was he wanted vanished with him. He'd stay for a night or two and then you'd get up and he'd be gone with all your things.
I managed to get a couple of jobs in Tamworth, met my future wife, Julie. That relationship centred around alcohol, and I would get angry and abuse her, and that turned into a pattern over time until she decided one day that she was in a dangerous relationship. She just started to see me for who I really was. I was 25 years old when I realised I was an alcoholic. I'd become my father. It's like a thief in the night, alcoholism. It takes away certain things and you don't even realise that they're gone until you want to use them. For example, tolerance, patience, friendliness, and they're not there anymore. There was a little period of my life where I was trying once again to get my life together and be the responsible citizen. I'd gone back to Tamworth and developed some contracts, cleaning, carpet cleaning, and I'd obtained this townhouse, and basically I had an open door policy because there were so many homeless people, and so I had free food, free drugs, free marijuana, free booze, and people would come and hang and forget to clean up after themselves. The third time I came in and the place was a mess again, and I went out to the truck, grabbed a jerry can of fuel, came in, started sloshing the fuel all over the walls. And I had a really nice Zippo lighter at the time. Flicked that, zipped it, threw it over into the petrol and whoosh, it went up.
It was like, oh, here we go again, more trouble. There's always more trouble. And we thought he was going to do better this time. This time he seems a little bit more settled. But the next thing you know, he's blowing up apartments.
The end result of that is I found myself in a security room at Tamworth Base Hospital with guards on the door. The psychiatrist came and he spent days talking to me. He said, the simple truth is I don't think you were responsible for your actions. I was pretty much transient for 3.5 years. I was hitchhiking up and down the East Coast just trying to find a meal.
We were driving on the M1 past Dreamworld and I looked out the window and I saw him hitchhiking, and I turned to my husband and I just said to him, keep driving. Because he's like, but that's your brother. And I'm going, yes, I know. Keep driving. Don't stop. We don't want him in our life. I just couldn't do any more trouble at that point.
If you don't want people to find you, you have to go where people won't go.
I'd exhausted all my options, and I was walking along these roads just southwest of Mullumbimby. And this dirt road seemed like a good idea at the time. And at the end of the dirt road, there was a forest. First night in there, it rained. It really rained. I was covered in leeches and soaking wet. I dragged my dry as a bone out and I put that over me. About 3 weeks in, I find myself eating anything that crawled. I've eaten beetles, worm, grubs. I started hunting land mullet, lizards, any lizard.
That's my bedroom window. So, this is my campsite, quite literally.
The forest took me back to when I was in that cupboard under the stairs in the orphanage, and I'd formed that place in my mind, of no humans, just a nice soft place. I was never going to glean enough produce from the forest to satisfy my addictions, so I established a nice little area north of my camp whereby I could grow some marijuana plants. Just that simple action opened up a whole trading network for me. It took me to the Byron Bay market, it took me to Sydney, it took me to lots of places. Some of that horticultural product I traded for cash, and I was able to buy homebrew kits. It was quite a lethal brew that brought me to my knees. My lineal recollection of time is not all that good. I don't have a lot of clarity around those couple of years in the forest because it was mixed in with psychosis. I'm off having conversations with some aliens or gremlins or my ancestors. My ancestors were saying, you can't live like this. And they're saying that they're concerned about me and that my health is deteriorating.
He had some simple choices to make. One choice was to go down the road of alcoholism, drug addiction, living out in the forest. That was a road to oblivion. Or take the very brave, necessary step for the alternative life of which he had no idea what that might look like.
I have no recollection of months after I exited the forest. The very next consciousness that I have was actually sitting on a park bench at the back of the Tweed Heads Hospital. I was still very sick. I still had psychosis. There was still a lot of confusion in my mind.
He was at death's door. He was a guy who had a whole range of problems that alcoholics experience, all the neurological problems. He used to walk with a stick. He could barely walk.
Now all of a sudden it struck me. I had created all this damage. I had caused all this mess. I thought I was fighting other people. I was fighting myself. My whole life I've been fighting myself. And I remember dropping to my knees and I'm thinking, I don't want to fight anymore. So I made a decision there on that park bench that I would do whatever it took not to be the person that I was there that day.
Well, he stopped drinking, and that made a huge difference because it took one big factor in violence away. And then his memory started getting better as well. He was able to function, to actually learn.
I'd always wanted to do my leaving certificate. I wanted to finish school. I never thought I was dumb. Everybody told me I was, but I didn't think I was. I started going to TAFE at Southport, so I found myself moving my possessions into the sand dunes closer to TAFE. When people would ask me where I lived, I'd just say, down next to the beach.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Gregory came to TAFE in 2003 and I was one of his teachers. Do you want to go and see a classroom?
Let's do it.
Okay.
That sounds good to me.
He came in and he was dressed unusually, so you could tell he'd had some life experiences. I was teaching adult tertiary preparation, which is a course designed for people who want a second chance at education.
Come and have a look at this room. It's so different.
I had the impression that his childhood had been challenging.
Do you remember where you used to sit?
No, not really.
I can remember, and I remember this for whatever reason, I have no idea. I remember you sitting about here. So it was a desk to the side.
I did. And the reason I sat down there was because I couldn't see anybody else.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I...
He sat and he cried one day, and they were sort of tears of frustration, but then they were tears of, can I really do this? And then he got on with the job.
And I remember you ringing me.
And so he would write draft after draft of an essay until he got it right.
This is amazing.
Yes.
But I think as the year progressed, he learnt to make friends and talk to people and enjoy the learning experience. I know he enjoyed the learning experience. He was like a sponge. He just absorbed everything you taught him and more. He learnt.
Towards the end of my TAFE experience, the tertiary prep, it was becoming evident that I would qualify for an invitation to university, and this word sociology kept jumping out at me. And when I looked up the definition of sociology, it was about, the study of human society. And I thought, yeah, I want to know about human society. I want to understand why I hate society so much.
I was a lecturer at Southern Cross University at the Coffs Harbour campus, and I was teaching what's possibly one of the most boring units on earth.
No, Richard was boring. Richard was so boring.
Gregory sort of put his hand up and goes, "Richard, do you mind if I say something?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, Gregory." And he goes, "I just want to say that I used to be a werewolf, but I'm over it now." And at that point, I said, "I like this guy. He's going to be my friend."
So I was doing some research for an assignment there, and in my search results, this Forgotten Australians kept coming up. Upwards of 500,000 kids, non-Indigenous, experienced some form of institutional care as children. I thought, that's me.
The Forgotten Australians report absolutely blew the lid off a history that was secret, that was covered up.
And it talks about the abuse that was systemic in Australian childcare for so long. And it talked about not being believed. One of the scariest things that can happen to you as a human being, I believe, is to think that you experience so much pain and trauma and isolation alone. But then to discover that there's a whole lot of people out there that have experienced the same thing. I didn't even need to talk to anybody after that. Just knowing that they existed was cathartic in itself. And it took some time for it to dawn on me that my sisters are Forgotten Australians as well. 2004 Christmas Day, I get a phone call from Wendy. She said to me, "I hear you haven't had a drink for 4 years." I said, "That's right." And she said, "Do you think we could have a talk?" How you doing?
How are you? When I met Gregory, I was in a place that everything I touched went sour.
I knew you were sick, like just from looking at you.
I just wanted to die. I was dead inside. I just wanted to die on the outside.
Yeah, I know that's right.
And get buried. I drank to remove myself from life. I drank to pass out so I could sleep. I didn't want to feel. I didn't want to dream. I didn't want to remember.
You're
not angry.
Yeah. No, I stopped being angry for a while. Actually, yeah. I couldn't move forward if I was still angry.
No. Gregory came back into my life 14 years ago. A totally changed person, an amazing example to me. Just to see him and just to hear the tone of his voice and the softness in his voice absolutely made me stop and listen to him.
I found one. Yeah. There's a couple of little places down there. And a couple of weeks later, her son Scott rang me. He said, "Can you help? My mum's really angry and really drunk." I just allowed her to talk. And then she cracked and she just jumped up and started smashing the place up. And I just let her go. When Wendy got up the next morning, She was devastated.
He led me to some people who have a program for people like me that drank the way I drank, and they showed me how they changed their lives. He supported me through that. My thinking was, if you can do it, then I can do it too.
She's never drank again. She's a different person today. She has a very good life today. When I was invited to do my honours, and I'm in discussion with Richard Hill about, well, what is an honours? I have no idea. I didn't even know what honours were. And he explained that to me. And then, well, what am I going to do honours on? And he turned around with this wry smile and he just looked at me. He said, well, why don't you do it on what you know best? What's that? You.
I became his supervisor. He wrote all his substantive chapters in about 6 months, and he got first class honours, and he got an APA scholarship. He did really well. He does stand head and shoulders above the rest. He's done a PhD. That's not an easy task.
Chancellor, I present to you Gregory Peel Smith, who has been admitted by you to the degree of Doctor of Philosophy.
So it just goes to show again the level of the work he's done, the level of the man he is.
When he was doing his PhD, he was interviewing people who had had a similar background, childhood.
Gregory's research is incredibly important. We need these oral histories to ensure that the experiences of those people aren't forgotten, and more importantly, that we have learnt the lessons of them.
They can go down underneath that and they never have to touch the top of your land.
He's now a lecturer. He doesn't big note himself. He just goes about things quietly.
He gets great feedback from students. Students love him, because he's very mindful of how he learnt.
The thing to remember is essays are people too. I respect and,
I think because of Gregory's background, it just makes it easy for him to relate to us and vice versa, really. And, no matter what age you are, you're able to do it. There's no barrier.
Yeah, that's been a big one for me.
Yeah.
But we can begin to see that these decisions have a wider impact on our society as a whole.
We met in my first year of doing a degree. I'd also been in institutions as a child, and I think the way that I dealt with it as an adult was to try and forget it. Gregory's way was different. It's like, this is also part of who I am.
Come in.
And it's actually a strength, not a weakness.
Good, how are you?
Yeah, I'm all right.
That was a real watershed for me.
And I think the fact that, you've got it straight from the horse's mouth is probably the most valuable.
I think Gregory represents how to take the crap in life and grow beautiful things out of it.
When I was into my PhD, I bought 25 acres just south of Grafton. I didn't want to be homeless anymore. And owning a piece of land meant nobody could kick me off it. Nobody could tell me I had no right to be there.
If you ask Gregory when he was up on the hill there outside Mullumbimby whether he would have had a property, whether he'd be a lecturer at university, he would have laughed at you. He would have said, you change your drugs.
Sometimes I come down in the morning, have a little bit of a reflection, a bit of meditation.
He told me that I could have a life, and it didn't matter what had happened to us as children, we could be good people, no matter what.
Richard Hill, to his credit, kept telling me that I wasn't a sociopath, but I still had these reservations. The idea of being a sociopath started to dissolve a little bit towards the end of my PhD. They told me I was stupid. If I can do a PhD, maybe I'm not so stupid. maybe they've made some mistakes on some of these other diagnoses. Today, I don't think I'm a sociopath. Yeah, I'm just another human being. Yeah, do the best I can, like most human beings.
So who is Gregory Smith? And why don't we start on the practice as usual side of the story of Greg Smith. What are the names we would have for the things that you saw that he did in his life? He's a sociopath. He's insane. He's a drunk. He's a drug addict. He is a drug dealer. He's angry. What about his violence? He beat his wife until she fled for her life. There are lots of words for people like him, don't we? He's a victim of child abuse. He was an orphan. An arsonist, yeah. There's all kinds of words to describe him and men like him. Tell me some other things about him in the story standing on the other side. What else is Gregory Smith? A survivor. What else did you say? He's an inspiration. He's a healer. He's a doctor of philosophy and a professor at Southern Cross University. I have a number of friends whose children had Dr. Smith as their, and they all said he was their favorite professor in their university experience. He ignited a whole response to the Forgotten Australians report. I would just want to visit that for a second. 500,000 non-Indigenous children who were institutionalized in Australia and who were abused and who were told that their experiences didn't matter. That's just the non-Indigenous people. There's a whole story, of course, we heard yesterday about the stolen generations. Gregory's advocacy and that community of Forgotten Australians really blew the lid off an industry, as you heard, that was filled with secrets about sexual abuse and violence and abuse, and mistreatment of vulnerable children by those who were paid to care for them. It led to an apology from the Prime Minister to all of the Forgotten Australians for the crimes committed against them. I mentioned Kate Alexander yesterday. The Office of the Senior Practitioner wrote a piece about another job that she had that's called I Have a Job Where I Say I'm Sorry. And what she and other executives in child protection are doing is they've been given lists as part of their jobs of the names and identities of former people who were victimized in that system, and they go and they pull together the records from the state on each victimized person, and they piece back the story of what happened to them and who their perpetrators were, and then they go find them and their children and their descendants, and they present the story of what happened to them and to their families, and then they apologize on behalf of the government. And in her piece, she writes the story of standing at the deathbeds of two Aboriginal women who lived short, violent lives as a consequence of their experiences. And she's explaining to them and their grandchildren and their children what really happened to their grandma and why her life was so hard, and then apologizing for the crimes committed against them by the state. You wonder, quite frankly, leaves me wondering, that's a country of 33 million people, and they had 500,000 non-Indigenous. I wonder how many forgotten Americans we have over the generations who have had this experience too. So Gregory Smith, and my point of showing this to you is a couple things. He's actually both things. He did set that fire. He did beat his wife until she fled for her life. He did all of those things. He is also a healer. He is also a professor. He is also an advocate for the rights of forgotten Australians. He is both things, and that's what we want to get to later today, is this idea as we approach our work of being able to hold at least two truths. This is where I think where we can join with Mr. Wood in terms of the work that he will do in the time he serves in his office. It is not whether or not children should be safe. They have to be safe. But it is also not okay to simply say that children being safe is all that matters. It is not one and it is not the other. It is both things. And our skill has to develop in our ability to hold at least two truths in the stories of who people are and who they can become. So this is hard for us, I think. It's hard for foster parents, it's hard for guardian ad litems and CASA volunteers and others, because the truth is that we will see and have seen terrible things in our work in child protection. We want children to be in kinship care, but we have had experiences or know of experiences with kinship providers who betrayed their responsibility and harmed those kids, haven't we? We've also known foster parents who have done this, and we know of adoptive parents who have done it. We know of first parents who have done it. We know of school teachers who have done it, of troop leaders, of priests, of pastors. There's no doubt that these things are true. But to have built a system that reacts to these things in a binary way and simply distills down the question to that single word of safety has failed us. There's a wonderful colleague, I can't call him a friend, I'd like him to be a friend, I have to get to know him, but his name is Padraig Ó Tuama, and Ó Tuama is a poet from Ireland. He is also formerly the leader of a community called Corrymeela, which is a multi-faith community in Northern Ireland, in Belfast and another location. And he recently left his position as leader there and is serving as a poet in that community, but is doing a lot of work in the United States. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a long-running national public radio show on weekends called On Being. It's called On Being now. It's with a person by the name of Krista Tippett. And he's been joining the staff at On Being in Minneapolis. Krista is a theologian by training, and she's done a long-running series of interviews with people from various faith traditions and science traditions, really exploring the big questions in life. And she's created an incredible body of work, and he and she are working together. Ó Tuama and his work at Corrymeela is what led to what I developed. It became known as mindful positioning, that drawing exercise. And that work at Corrymeela is also based in this idea of being able to be able to see people, to see the full. In the narrative tradition, we talk about the full, thick stories of people. That's really what we're after. We want to learn to tell the full, thick stories of people, rather than these flattened single stories. Kenny becomes a single story of a kid, a traumatized kid with mental health diagnoses, living in a locked facility, who may have to move in a few months. There's while Kenny exists as a full human with full capabilities and with the gifts given to him, and we know that, but we have a system that tells the single story of him instead. And what do we use single stories to do? We use it to flatten people's experiences, to dehumanize people, to justify our own role in their lives. And yet we call it therapeutic, or we call it safe. But I want to get back to Ó Tuama. Here's what he gives. He's among other things, he's an expert in effectively in peacemaking, and of course his context is Ireland. And now he is actually from the Republic of Ireland, but he's been in Northern Ireland for many years. And in his context was the story of the Troubles, the murders between people in Northern Ireland and over time. And he said this about safety that I think is an interesting reflection from a society that knows something about living without safety. And that is, listen to the language here, that one person's safety is another person's terror. You know, that Kenny's safety for us has been terror for him. The single story justifies this terroristic experience, which is truly, if there were forgotten Americans like there are forgotten Australians, he would be one, wouldn't he? You know, we are really challenged in the face of this new knowledge to confront the urgent need for justice, I think, in our work. That we've got to learn to see more broadly that it isn't simply making this system work. It really is about an investment in the person right in front of us. I'm going to finish this stuff this afternoon, but just as we get ready for our lunch break, starting with the slide you've been looking at all day, engagement is relationship. We have talked for decades, particularly because of wraparound, I think, about this challenge of engagement, right? That's a common conversation. It is a word that we all know. But I really recognized through the research of family finding, when I recognized that what we had learned, that in fact these people did exist who were said not to exist, and that we began to view them through the lens of permanency, which was the idea of ready-made families, right? Either you're ready-made or you're not. And if you're not ready-made, you're made to disappear. But it really made me think about this word engagement and about how we practiced engagement. And what I come to believe is that seeking to engage someone in order to get information from them that you will make use of is in fact exploitation, isn't it? And so I would argue that real engagement is a relationship. If I call the grandmother to say, I am so worried about Kenny, he's safe right now-ish, but I'm really worried. It would make such a difference if you could tell me, if you were given the opportunity to fill a room with people who you believe would help you and your family find a way to live safely together, and Kenny could come home. Who would you want there? And she could answer that question and might very well do it, but here's the point. And then what? And what I think happened with family finding is we'd make a list of those people and we would send letters because we have to meet the statutory requirement. And we would begin to use that information for our process of looking for a ready-made family. Rather than, I think what is more appropriate is to imagine a relationship with this grandmother. We're going to walk together for a time as you and your family confront what happened and what led Kenny to be in this place. You know, it's building, offering a commitment of a relationship between you and her to confront. Listen to the language. This is from something called Participatory Learning in Action, or PLA, sometimes now called participatory research. Listen to these principles. Here's the first one. The family has the ability, let me reframe. Kenny's family has the ability and the responsibility to face the problems that most affect their lives. Do you believe that? That's an interesting and powerful statement. Remember, I talked about the work in Battambang, in Cambodia, through the Cambodian Children's Trust. In every instance, the family holds the solution, ties to that participatory idea that families have the ability and the responsibility to face the challenges that most affect their lives. Do you notice as I tie that to safety, there's nothing in that principle that says Kenny needs to move in their house right now. Not necessarily because they're unsafe, but maybe because he is. Right? Do you see what we call delinking here? One of the things that we've done is a history, and this isn't just true in the United States, it's very true in Western Europe, it's true in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and other places. We have linked, always linked the question of a child's safety with the ability of families to actually participate. If we see the family as unsafe, then we then separate children, forcibly separate them, as we found out with the border, from that. We link safety to participation. In this approach, what we would call it is delinking. We delink the question of safety, because children must be safe, from the opportunity and the dignity, and I would add the responsibility of the family to meet. Do you see what I mean? There's work for adults to be doing when it comes to the safety of children. They may for a time not be able to be together. Does that make sense? But our mistake is that we've got a system that has conflated the two things. Right? Does that make sense? So one key to you is that as you talk to your partners who will continue to think in terms of the ability for the family to play a role, is always based on the question, are they appropriate? Right? We're in Kansas, we're in Missouri. So we can talk about guns here, right? Because you got a nice gun culture going on. But I think about you would know this, but it's an Olympic sport with shotguns. There's two of them that you probably know about, one called trap and one called skeet, right? You walk up to the line with a shotgun, and you're the gunner, and then you've got somebody who's responsible for releasing the target, and when you're in position, you say the word pull, and what do you hope to do when when the clay pigeons come out? Yeah, well, the language they would use is powder it. And that's exactly what our child welfare system's been doing to people, especially as family finders. We go up to the line, we do our search, we identify people, and you can hear the words pull, and somebody's job is to powder that thing. Because we've linked our view of what our responsibility for child safety is to the question about whether people have the dignity to be in the room and have anything to say about what happens to themselves and their children. You see, it's inherently, quite frankly, violent. And by the way, how many rich kids are you working with? So for who do we do this? And is this what you decided to give your one sacred life to? Is the question we each have to confront. It is possible to maintain the safety of children while delinking the opportunity for the family to come at the table and do what we believe they are responsible for. You are all familiar, we'll wrap this up and then have lunch, and then I'll show you the superpower right after lunch. You're all familiar with a common term in the United States, and it's something called the American dream. Does anybody want to remind me what you think the American dream is? Do you remember this? What is the American dream?
Big house, big expense, 2.5 kids.
Yeah. And what we say as Americans is we prize more than anything else about our democracy a word that starts with F, and then the word is freedom. And we say that people have the freedom in this democracy to achieve the American dream, don't we? And we built our governance around that. We built what's been described as American exceptionalism around this. In today, I hate to disabuse anyone of this, but I did hear this the other day. Actually, in terms of living the American dream, we are ranked 20th in the world. If you actually want to live the American dream, go to Copenhagen, Denmark. You will have a real opportunity to live the American dream in Copenhagen, not in Missouri. You know, but I'm going somewhere in terms of an alternate approach, not I don't want to be accused of sedition here. I'm really just trying to get someplace. I want to come back to something that I think is important to get clear-headed about, because we've all been shaped by this as members of our culture. And that culture, that history of freedom, that history of American dreams. You've got the freedom in this country to be anything you want to be. You've heard this one before. But I want to think about Kenny. What does Kenny have the freedom to do? Well, if we apply that strict idea, it's all, you know, once Kenny's 19, who's this going to be on? That's exactly where I wanted to go with this. That is, don't forget that is exactly what the community believes too about Kenny. If Kenny would get his stuff together and do the things he needs to do, take advantage of the opportunity of all of this gift, then Kenny can be anyone he wants to be in this democracy. Isn't that the working belief? It is. But let me offer an alternative one that's growing in movement in the world, including in the United States, which is, I talked about a little bit yesterday, which is Sen's capabilities model, or some have even said Sen. And Nussbaum is an American academic. Sen is an economist, originally from India. And Sen won the Nobel Peace Prize for economics around this concept of what he called a capabilities model, and then Nussbaum later made important contributions and commentary on his work. But what he talked about, this really interesting, I might have mentioned this yesterday, but I want to get to a point about this and tie it back to Kenny and how we view him, and his family, is that what he studied that led to his Nobel Peace Prize was on the continent of India, I believe, if I'm right, or maybe it was Pakistan. But what he studied were famines, and famines where often there were large losses of life. You've seen these in your life. You guys remember Live Aid's roots, you know, all the way back in the 80s. But these examples of trying to raise money for people who are starving in the world through famine, and where large, you know, Somalia comes to mind as an example, and there are others. But what Sen looked at was comparing different famines that had different outcomes. And there were famines where many thousands or tens of thousands died starving to death in place because they couldn't get nutrition. And then there were other famines where large numbers of people did not die because they were starving and there were no food in their area, but what they did realize is if they got up and carried each other and walked, and they went sometimes 100 miles away or 200 miles away, there was food, and they got themselves there, they were able to get this aid, and they survived. And what Sen got famous for was understanding what was the difference between the group that realized there was food over there, got up and went there and lived, and the other people who just stayed in place, because it turned out there was food in equal distance to them too. And they could have walked there. Why didn't they? And here's the point of Sen's model. It is not this American dream notion that you can be anything you want to be, but it does tie to a word called freedom. It is not whether people physically have the ability to get up and walk over and eat that food. It is whether they believe they have the freedom to get up and walk over and get that food. Kenny has no freedom to do all the things he might do. Kenny's family has no freedom to do the things they might do because they're all looking at us because we've been given that authority. Does that make sense? And we've made it complex in terms of tying safety to people's freedom. And there's nothing democratic about that. You know, there's nothing democratic about denying Americans the ability to come to the table together and confront the things that most affect their lives, especially when their own children are on the line. But that is exactly the tradition we fell into. By the way, we did not create it. We inherited it from our colonizers. But one thing I would say is standing in it, you know, our tradition is that we justify taking people's freedoms away and their dignity for participation using a single word, safety. Remember what Padre Gotuma said, one person's safety is another person's terror. It's not ever as simple as that. It's not about ignoring or not prioritizing child safety. It is about holding two truths. Children must be safe, and families must have the dignity and the opportunity to confront the problems that most affect their lives. And where are we in this story? Where we have been placed historically is to replace the family with good people like foster parents and group homes and social workers and therapists and lawyers and volunteers. I think, and this comes again from this capabilities research, is that what we know from trillions of dollars of investment in aid work around the world over decades from the United States is, as I talked about yesterday, is what we know is that helping people is an inherently dangerous business. And that what we learned from these experiences, if we were willing to accept the research, the literature, if we say we really do stand in evidence, we have that evidence. And that evidence is that if you're not extremely careful about your role as an outsider coming into a life of a family, you can very easily make it a lot worse rather than better. And so you have to be really careful about how you use your influence and your authority and how much attention you need to have from them in order for them to have the freedom to confront these needs. And what we really land on is the language of the three things that we can be that I've said several times. I'm just contextualizing. There's only three things that we can be with those parents we talked about. We can be a convener. We can be a catalyst. We can act as a facilitator. We may be one of these things, we may be two of these things, we may be three of these things. It depends on the circumstances, but we are not more than that. The healing in that marriage that has played out so terribly in the lives of these kids is their work to do, not my work to do, right? There's no therapist that can fix it for them. There's no social worker that can fix it for them. But there may be therapists and there may be social workers who can stand with them while they confront it and stay with them as they do, right? Is that making sense as a framing? So what I want to finish as we go to lunch is give you a frame of what is different about this. The original model of family finding was simply around those three questions. Do these people exist or do they not exist? Are they, can we find the minutes because we say we have no time to find them? Yes, we could. And finally, if we found people, would they be safe and willing to come to the table? Almost universally, the answer was yes. In fact, when I was in Belgium last year, I did 3 back-to-back boot camps over 3 weeks. We worked with over almost 600 families that I coached over 3 weeks. So in 3 weeks, I supervised twice the population in your specialty program. Thank God that's a lot easier than having to actually do the work. But what I want to say to you, because they were doing exactly the same thing in their own particular way, was simply this. What I was struck by the end of the 3rd boot camp is not just that we found the families and we were able to convene them, but they metaphorically, if not literally, came running. You know, when we say to a grandmother, I'm a family finder and I found you, my experience is grandmothers will say, I wasn't hiding. You just didn't call me. You know, people are hungry to live good lives. They're waiting for us to include them. It's pathetic to think that what they're waiting for us to do is include them in healing their own lives, isn't it? Again, back to the concept of freedom. There's no freedom there. But really, our change has to be our willingness to do this. Here's the big change. The big change in what I call Family Finding Model Revision 1 is it isn't about finding people, and it is not about engaging people. It is about convening people. It is about the family meetings. And the family meetings not as a transactional, extractive, give me a plan, give me a ready-made family, did you get your background check done, where's the home study at, did you make your visit, were you appropriate, was it meaningful, let me get my checklist out, kind of meeting. It's understanding that, and as I'll show you after lunch, that there is a healing power in convening people, in human encounter. The reason that I agreed to come here and risk my life for you today, or in fact potentially risk yours, was there is a power in human encounter. We can't have this experience very well looking at devices. There is a power. It is built into our biology. We, here's a couple sayings that have been used that really make the point. Have you heard this one? Human emotion is contagious. It's contagious. We often think of contagion as a negative thing, right? But think of the other side of contagion. Maybe healing is contagious. Maybe patience is contagious. Maybe hope is contagious. So if you understood and accepted that human emotion is contagious, and imagine the power of bringing people into the room over and over and over again. And by the way, if doing it on Zoom is what you can do that too. I had some good meetings this summer I got to watch with Zooms with families in other states, and they were very useful. And people were reached by it. It's just that it limits us when we can't use our full person, right? There's biology in our bodies so that when I get no more than 6 feet away from you, but we have an extraordinary body. Let me just finish with a fun story to make that point. A story I heard about training psychiatrists at Harvard Medical School. I have a number of friends who were trained there. And the story I heard was at some point in their residency. So residencies, they finished their medical studies and now they're working in a hospital, and have you watched this on TV? They don't let these poor people sleep and they just keep them going, and they have to sleep in gurneys sometimes. And you would think, wow, that is the worst training ever. It's almost like child welfare. But why do they do that? Why do you think in residency, at least in medical rotations, why do you think they keep them in the hospital and give them that kind of intense exposure? And that is what they recognize is these are people who have a lot of book knowledge and a lot of practical learning in the sense of classroom-based learning and laboratory learning, but what they don't have is experience. They haven't seen many patients, and there really is no substitute for seeing patients. And so the idea of this very intense schedule is they want you to get as many repetitions as possible, see as many patients as you can during your residency, because you're gonna pack in all of that experience and repetition before you get out in the world and do some real damage, right? So, but psychiatry, this particular part I like is something about how our bodies work, and if you can tune into this, how powerful it is. And the story I heard, and I heard about Harvard, it could be at other places too, was the story was that people in residency at some point would have this experience. They would take a resident who's doing a psychiatry residency, and they would sit them on a stage in the theater with a chair, and across from them they would bring a person from the community who was seeking free mental health care. And it's a lot of how teaching hospitals work, right? People who don't have access to paid health care might come and volunteer to be part of teaching others if they can receive their care for free. So there's a patient there, and the setup is 2 chairs, the psychiatry resident sitting in one, the patient sitting in the other, and they're on a stage, and people are just coming in and from time to time filling the balcony and kind of watching this unfold. And all that's going to happen is the resident is going to conduct a standard psychiatric assessment interview with the person sitting there, right? They're going to probably spend 20 minutes going through a rote set of questions and having a conversation. When it is about done, and of course the people moderating this will know because they know what the questions are, they're going to page one of the senior psychiatrists in the facility who will be off doing their business, and they're going to page them and they're going to call them to the theater. And when they get to the theater, about that time, the interview will be over. They weren't there for it. And when they walk up, they come onto the stage and they stand near the two people for a moment, just sort of stand there quietly, and then look to the patient and say, "So you're depressed?" And almost always get exactly what the chief complaint is without having a conversation at all. And what they're showing these residents is this extraordinary embodied ability that we have, if we will tune into it, to be incredibly aware of the state of other people. Emotions are contagious. We have many gifts for understanding how people are doing around us, sometimes better at experiencing them than even ourselves. Emotions are contagious. In the power of human encounter, why family meetings, not to transact deals with them for ready-made parents, but the power of that experience of being together and confronting the challenge that most affect our lives and finding ways as facilitators to help people do that safely, right? Both emotionally and otherwise, and doing it over and over and over and over again. At a high level, if we're doing this well, one of the things that we would spend most of our time doing is either organizing those meetings or being in those meetings, right? As part of an intervention strategy that they build in the meeting. Ultimately, what we talked about, the mindful positioning tool, it's not, and also I would even add the formulation exercise. Those are exercises for us to get positioned, but I wouldn't take what I think that information is and impose it on the family. What I want to do is part of facilitation is have the family and the network do the mindful positioning work. You decide, what the tools are. By the way, one of the things we do with drawings, if we were doing a boot camp, we would do it, is we'd actually do 3 of them. We do the first, what's it been like? What are the metaphors? What's it look like? If it were really working, what do you think that is? And then we would write an unmet needs statement, as we started doing. And what would we use the unmet needs statement to do is to test whether or not the second drawing is really right. Because there's a little saying I heard in Sacramento, California, never heard afterwards. It's called, don't stumble over better on the way to best. So, for example, talking about Kenny, him roasting in the flames, which also we called treatment and paid $1 million for, and get it for cheap at the chicken shop. Then that second drawing, what is the second drawing? Him living with grandma, let's say, okay? But to Bill's point, that might be better than roasting over the flames in the system, but is it actually what this kid needs by itself? For some kids, the answer might be yes. But for this kid, I think that's what Bill's getting to, is I suspect what this little boy's going to do when you put him with his family is he's going to play out what traumatized people invariably do. He will do his best to recreate what's happened to him in the relationship with his grandmother. I don't know him, but I'm guessing that. One last piece I would say, it's another terrible metaphor, a nice American one, which is a lot of times these kids become like heat-seeking missiles when it comes to blowing up relationships. And what that is the hallmark of an embodied childhood trauma or an adult trauma is the unfortunate ability to elicit from other people in your life the very things you do not need. And we know that. And so to Bill's point, we've got to be working with the family. By the way, I don't know that grandma doesn't do that herself. Right? And it's okay to talk about that, because remember, there was something that happened in this family a long time ago. This was never about Kenny until it became about him, right? And so if we're not able to talk about and work through the things that happened. By the last thing, talking about trauma, we, again, have a deficit-based system, and we look at trauma as a disease. We look at traumatic experience and its consequence as a disability. But that is not what the science says about what trauma is. The best science that we've got comes from people like Rachel Yehuda, from people like Bessel van der Kolk, and Yehuda being the one I really have connected to in terms of the way she approaches this. She describes what trauma is as optimization. Here's an interesting way to think about it. If you were in combat, who would you want in the foxhole with you? Someone who could sleep through anything, or someone who was hypervigilant? Right? Trauma if we look at it through the lens of evolutionary science, is an adaptation that human beings have for optimization. Not only do we individually have the ability for our bodies to be changed by a traumatic experience, which is what a trauma is an embodied change. It is something that happens out there that changes something in here. It's not simply a psychological wound, it is an alteration to the super system. The other part of that story is that we have evidence that we can transfer the epigenetic changes that are part of traumatic experience to our babies. Yehuda proved this in studying the offspring of Holocaust survivors, and then later was able to replicate those findings with women who were pregnant on 9/11 and were in the two towers when they were hit by aircraft. Depending on the stage of pregnancy, she saw the same epigenetic markers that increased the likelihood that the offspring of these women would have a 30% greater vulnerability to developing post-traumatic stress disorder in their lives. Not a disability, an optimization. You live in a world where somebody thinks it's a good idea to fly an airplane into the building you're working in. Or for Jews, you lived in a world where there was a group of people who thought rounding up people because of their ethnicity and faith and putting them on trains and putting them in gas chambers was a good idea. In a world like that, if you're going to have a baby, it's probably a gift to them to prepare them for what they will face, isn't it? That is a different and more useful view of what trauma is. It is an optimization that we have an evolutionary advantage for. Effectively, that makes me think that if this kid is that heat-seeking missile, that what that really is about is this kid has a whole set of new superpowers that he has in his body and brain as a result of these horrific experiences in his life that are not a disability at all, but in fact, this kid is not disabled, he is a Ferrari. This kid, from a biological standpoint, is perfectly made to live exactly the life that he's living. Look at how creative he is about avoiding getting these beatdowns from these people. How much do you think he thinks about it? How well do you think he sleeps at night? How much trouble is he willing to take with adults by not being where he's supposed to be so that it doesn't happen? How would you do if I put you there in his place tonight with your skill set? And if you were going to do it, wouldn't you want him with you? Because he would show you how to get it done, wouldn't he? But the problem is that these adaptations may not work well for him in other settings, especially if he doesn't fully understand what those adaptations are. So our work with people with traumatic experience in part is to really help people over time to reconnect to the body, to begin to know their bodies differently, to know this new, I wrote about this recently, to see with new eyes. Whether you know it or not, you were given new eyes. You can see now what you could not see before. Unfortunately, sometimes your body tricks you and you see it even when it doesn't exist. And you react to it. Yehuda had a patient who said this to her after she treated her in a group session. She said, Dr. Yehuda taught me that I have really bad shock absorbers in some situations in my life. And and I've learned what those situations are and how to handle it because I know that I don't have the shock absorbers to be able to get through those times. And it's her, and by the way, Yehuda said, I never said that to her. I have no idea what she's talking about. But it is a wonderful example of how she came to her own insights about this new body she lives in, about these new capabilities that she holds, and how to navigate life with people and find safety in relationships again. Right? Okay. So when you come back, we're going to learn this super power. Let me give you a name for it. Just think about we call it how to fill a room with a word. Okay. So we'll see how fast can we get to networks, and I'll teach you that you can get to a network sometimes with a single word. Okay. So how about you have your lunch, and I'll see you in an hour. Okay. Thank you.